year when he will be in charge of your studies when you go to SHSS. Clearly, Professor Pugh today is going to talk about the origins of war, and hopefully there will be some time after the lecture for you guys to ask some questions or answer some questions from Professor Pugh. And remember, Professor Pugh is an anthropologist, so he'll be very pleased to hear that some of you guys are not all going to want to do economics, but some of you might want to do other subjects. So,
okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. This is my favorite part of the semester, or one of my favorite parts of the semester. I always like talking to the ARM classes, because you guys are an interesting group, and I really like what you're doing. I like the way this class is designed. And so what I want to do is give you a little sense of a topic that's very near to me. One of my areas of research is human warfare, why humans fight, how humans fight, and sort of what separates war from other kinds of violence. But I really want to use this lecture as a chance to give you all a sense for how we do research in the social sciences. Really speak to this class of ARM. And so I want to use this as just a case study in sort of a big idea that affects humans, you and me, right, included, and how we can investigate that and why we would care about a question like this in the social sciences in general. And again, I'm an anthropologist, which as you guys may or may not know, I'm sure you have some background here. Right? Anthropology is the study of humans, everything that has to do with humans. It's a big, huge area, and we claim a lot of territory. But one of the interesting things about anthropology is that we draw in a lot of political science. We draw in economics, and we draw in engineering and science and physics, and all sorts of subjects to tie it together. So give you a sense for how we do that. So. And the topic we're going to talk about today, and you'll forgive me if I move kind of quickly because I do want to give you a chance to ask questions at the end. But the topic we're going to do today is sort of where does war come from? So how did it begin? Why do humans fight wars? And this is obviously an enormous question. And we really have to start even in the beginning with asking, what does that mean? When we say, how did war begin? Right? We're asking a historical question. Right? When in prehistory did we first see war? We're asking a biological question, sort of what is it about humans biologically in our biological past that allows us to fight wars or that compels us to fight wars? We're asking a social question, what does war mean? Right? How is it different than other kinds of violence? And why do we see that? So there's a big question. Today I'm going to break it down into a very small piece. If you come to SHSS, and you're there for a while, I teach a class in this big question. We can spend a whole semester tearing it apart, but today we'll deal with a smaller piece of it. But then so the other thing that we have to do in social science, when we have a big question like, why do humans fight? Other questions we deal with in social science, sort of, where does gender come from? How does it affect society? We deal with questions like, how do people of different ethnicities get along? Big interesting question. We deal with questions like, how do economic markets work? Similar process. You're going to tear it down into these smaller pieces. Whenever we do this, we have to then figure out what kinds of evidence can speak to this question. And I understand you guys are preparing your project portfolios right now for ARM, so I'm sure you guys are doing a lot of this. Big question, what kind of evidence can I provide? And so today we're going to look at three areas. Primates, so non-human animals that are similar to humans, primarily chimpanzees. Archaeology, study of the past through material record, and ethnography, study of living cultures. We'll look at that. And the last thing I want to leave you with, this is always a big question in anthropology and in any social science, is that there's not always a right answer. And I know that's really frustrating, especially if you're used to studying things and your teacher's asking you, okay, give us the answer. Tell us the answer. And what you're going to find when you come to SHSS, and I'm sure you're already finding here because my colleagues in CPS are very similar in their approach to academics, is we don't always think there is a right answer. I'll ruin the ending of my lecture by telling you I don't know where war comes from. I have some good ideas, but I'm not going to give you the answer to the question today. And I want you to come to SHSS thinking like that there's not always a right answer. What we want you to be able to do is to make an argument. Tell us what the data is, tell us what evidence you can use to approach this, but you're not necessarily going to be able to tell us the end story. Today we'll see a few different answers to this question that aren't always the same. Now, before we get into that, to me the most important question that we have to ask here is, what is war? What is this thing we're talking about? Before we can start asking where it comes from. So, I'm asking you now. Who here can tell me what war is? What characterizes war? Yes, sir.
It's an armed conflict between two states in which more than a certain sum of people die.
Wow, okay, that's a good full answer. So it's an armed conflict, so that's good. You've got conflict and you've got weapons between two states, okay? We'll come back to that a little bit, in which groups of people die. Is that right?
Well, over a certain sum of people. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. So you think there's a minimum number of people that has to die? Good. That's a great way to start. Other answers to this? Okay. So let me take this apart a little bit. So you said it's an armed conflict between two states. Is it possible to have war not between states? Oh, I saw a hand. Yes.
It's the Civil War.
Civil war. Okay, so within a state.
It's an armed conflict in the country.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily between two states or more than two states. It could be in the country.
Okay. What about other examples of war that might not? Okay, take it first.
And also, war should include maybe some planning and some aim of this.
Planning and I sense that some of you have seen some of this before. That's good. Planning is very important. That's
War against ideologies, like war against terrorism or poverty also could be.
interesting. Right. So one thing we can do now that we've started working up a definition to war, that we've got planning, we've got some reasons, we've got people working together. We can start taking a look at more abstract. Can we fight poverty? Can we fight terrorism? Can we fight obesity? Right? Can we fight all of these things that people love to fight wars? Great. Okay, so those are some good definitions. I'd love to spend the rest of the day talking about this, but I want to kind of move on. For now, I want you to plant in the back of your head this question. As we look at these different approaches to what war is, the people who give us different answers make assumptions for themselves about what's war. So you should be thinking about yourself, when we see this, is this really war? Yeah, okay. Lots of interesting stuff there. We can talk about whether or not people even have to die. Okay, so with that as sort of a foundational sort of discussion about what it is we're talking about, I think we're all roughly on the same page. We all agree that war is something that involves lots of people, it involves planning, it involves conflict, often involves violence and death. Where does that come from, right? Humans, arguably, are the only animals in the world that fight wars. We can see conflict between other groups of animals. I have dogs in my house, and dogs certainly like to fight. They organize themselves, but the ways that they fight are different. So there's something uniquely human about this. And if we can understand what's uniquely human about war, we might be able to understand ways that we can reduce the amount of war in the world, that we can cope with the effects of war. This can be a very interesting thing. And so there have been hundreds of approaches to answering the question. And today I'm going to show you 3 approaches to the question of where does war come from? Why do humans fight wars? And the first one I'm going to look at comes from the area of what we call primatology, which is a science that studies non-human animals that are similar to humans, primates. Monkeys, apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, things like that. Based on the idea that we share a common ancestor deep in evolutionary history, and our social behavior is very similar to certain kinds of primates, we often look at chimpanzees especially for models of some kinds of human behavior, especially when we're asking questions like this about where does it come from deep in the past. And if we see behaviors that are the same in primates as they are in humans, then we can start thinking about, is there a common history here? So, one of the common areas to look at the question of where does human warfare come from is to look at fighting in chimpanzees. This is a picture of 2 bonobo chimpanzees. They're actually playing, they're having fun, this is not fighting. But we can look at the violence in these animals and see if it shows any similarities. And when we get into talking about the evidence from the realm of primates, for discussing the origins of human war, I want to tell a little story about how we know so much about chimpanzee violence. And this story has to do with this woman, Jane Goodall. Have you guys heard of Jane Goodall?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Seen pictures of her? There was a new movie out a couple years ago called Chimpanzees that she featured in. Did you see it? It was by Disney. It was really cool. If you haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look. Jane Goodall is famous for studying chimpanzees. And she gives us a really interesting story about science and about the role of women in science and sort of how scientific knowledge is created. In the 1960s, Jane Goodall was a graduate student. She was working on a doctorate degree and wanted to understand basic social behavior among chimpanzees. She wasn't thinking about violence, but she went to the Gombe Preserve in Central Africa, where chimpanzees live more or less in the wild, and spent a year observing chimpanzees, writing down what she saw, taking photographs, keeping records, doing all kinds of sciencey type things, creating data. And one thing she saw was that the chimpanzees fought. Now this was mind-blowing. Because in the 1960s, most anthropologists, most ethologists, which are people who study animal behavior, and most primatologists, people who are interested specifically in chimpanzees, thought that chimpanzees were peaceful. What we understood, what we as scientists in the 1960s understood, was that chimpanzees were happy little fuzzy animals that hung out in the woods and they ate bananas and they loved each other all day long, right? Sort of like on a cartoon. And what she saw was that in fact they fought each other to get food. Sometimes they killed each other. She was the first person to document, the first person in sort of the English-speaking world, at least certainly in Central Africa, people were aware of this, but the first person in the scientific community to document hunting. Chimpanzees hunt small monkeys, kill them, and eat the flesh, right? Everybody in this room who's from Kazakhstan undoubtedly eats meat, right? This is not shocking to us, but to see chimpanzees doing this was really disturbing. And so she came back from her field work as a student, right? Not much older than you guys. She was in her early 20s when she did this first. She comes back and writes a paper that gets published that says, chimpanzees fight, hunt, kill, beat, abuse, do all these terrible things. And what was the response from the scientific community? Bah, rubbish. You're crazy. Right? Here's this woman, certainly in the 1960s, women didn't have a prominent place in science in the Western world, who's saying something that's totally different than what anybody in the scientific community believes. And they said, there's no way, you're crazy. Right? So what did she do? And I want you to take this as a life lesson. Those of you who go into any kind of research, social science, humanities, hard sciences, people will always tell you you're wrong. And when people tell you you're wrong, that's awesome. Right? Because as a scientist, you want to be saying things that make people uncomfortable. You want to be coming up with things that challenge the way people understand the world, or else, frankly, what you're doing is not that interesting. Now, don't do that just to do it. Right? Sometimes you'll find data that is not that challenging. But when you find data that's challenging and people tell you you're wrong, your response should not be to cry. Your response should not be to run away or to agree with what they've said. Your response is to go back and get more data. And so that's what she did. Right? She went back to the Gombe Nature Preserve in Central Africa, looked at more chimpanzees, saw more chimpanzees fighting, got videos, not videotape, this is still reel to reel, we're in the 1960s here. But she got video of chimpanzees fighting, brought it back, showed her colleagues, and they said, holy cow, chimpanzees are violent, right? And so this is how science works. You get enough data, you challenge models enough, and scientific knowledge changes. It's really important to understand. Scientific knowledge is never final. It's always subject to debate, right? Subject to debate through empirical observation, testing models, and bringing it back. Right? It's one of the things we love about science, that we never know the right answer. Well, we have some good ideas, but not necessarily the end. So, she brought it back, and the community of scientists, at least in the English-speaking world, said, holy cow, it's true, chimpanzees fight, they kill, they hunt, they do this nasty, violent stuff. But, now they had to start investigating other things. I'll save you 30 years here of academic history. But they basically said, well, there's something environmental, there's something about her being there, she's provoking them. This set off about 30 years of scientific study of chimpanzee aggression, which basically reconfirmed over and over and over again that yes, in fact, chimpanzees fight, yes, in fact, they kill each other, yes, in fact, they hunt. They are really aggressive animals. Right? Let this also be a life lesson. They're very cute, but they will kill you. People get killed by chimpanzees when they try to keep them. Don't take one as a pet. So, anyway, fast forward to about the 1970s, when Jane Goodall really is starting to become famous, late 70s, early 80s, and the scientific community has now accepted that chimpanzees are violent. And so this sets off a whole new area of scientific research with trying to understand how chimpanzee violence works. And we'll look at that next. But for our question about where does human warfare come from, this might provide an answer. Anthropologists interested in the question of where does human warfare come from? One of the reasons this was a big question in the past was that there was no evolutionary answer. The chimpanzees, who seem to be our evolutionary cousins, don't do it. And now we see that they're very violent. And so one of the answers that was very popular in the 1980s to this question, and is still very popular, became popular in the 1980s, is that maybe humans fight wars because we're kind of like chimpanzees. It's something left over. A vestige is this word. Do you guys know this word, vestige? It's not a very common English word. It means something left over. A vestige of the past means that in the past, our ancestors fought. We don't really need to fight anymore, but since we're related to them, we still do it. So this is the big idea coming into the 1980s. Okay. Now, if we start from this as our model, right? And again, in science, social science, like all other kinds of science, we start with models, big ideas for how the world works, break them down into testable hypotheses, and then we can confirm or deny those models, right? And so if our model is that humans fight because we're related to chimpanzees, it's something that's from our past, what we need to know now to understand what it means for humans is sort of why chimpanzees fight. What are the conditions? What does this tell us about being a chimpanzee? Can it tell us anything about being human? And to save you, we'll skip over many decades of many years of research here. The best evidence we have for how and why chimpanzees fight has to do with how they use territory. So very quick sort of a primer here on how chimpanzees use territory. Very, very detailed map. You can see I spent a lot of time making this. Chimpanzees basically divide their territory up into big areas in the jungle. And so each of these orange sort of areas represents an area where a bunch of chimpanzees live. They'll spend most of their time here in this sort of gray area that's called the core territory. The male chimpanzees especially spend almost all of their time there. And the way chimpanzees live their lives is males live together, big groups of guys, right, hanging out. And the ladies, the female chimpanzees, live out here most of their time in the periphery territories in small groups of related females with the babies. When the young males get old enough, they move into the core with the other guys. Now, so what has been observed is that this is the normal way that chimpanzee territoriality works. In some cases, there's a little bit of overlap, but generally speaking, the territories are separated from one another. Now, in studying how these chimpanzees use territory, we've come to understand a lot about why chimpanzees fight. Again, the question is, why do humans fight? The answer, the big model seems to be because chimpanzees fight, we're related to chimpanzees. So then why do chimpanzees fight? The best we can tell, it has to do with how they use territories. Now, this is a picture of a trip out into, just a group of male chimpanzees who are leaving that core territory, and they're going out into the periphery. They do this pretty regularly, and the vast majority of times that the male chimpanzees go into the periphery, they go on a trip that's called an excursion, which is just, it means that they're like taking a picnic. It's a happy trip. They go out, they hang out with the female chimpanzees, maybe they make baby chimpanzees, maybe they hang out with the baby chimpanzees, they eat fruit, maybe they do a little hunting, and when they're doing this is like on the TV or the cartoons, right? And you guys have seen pictures of chimpanzees hanging out, and it's, woo, yeah, they're happy, they're dancing around, and it looks like a beach party out in the jungle. This is the vast majority of time that chimpanzees have been observed in mixed sex groups with males out in the territory. This is the kind of stuff they're doing, right? They're having sort of a family holiday. Now, it has also been observed that occasionally, when the chimpanzees are out here in the peripheries, they'll break out of these parties, right? And they'll break into something called a patrol. Chimp patrol, and it sounds like a name of a cute movie. This is a picture actually of a patrol. So what happens in this case is that this mixed sex group that's so noisy and so rambunctious and having so much fun, they'll suddenly dead quiet. And it's like somebody flipped a light switch at the party. They go from dancing around, eating fruit, and playing to total silence. And the male chimpanzees will line up in a perfect single file line like this, and they'll just walk out to the edge of the territory. Right. They're looking around, they're sniffing. Really, really different behavior. Right? This is really awesome. This was first documented by one of my professors. I'm very proud of this, a guy named John Matani from the University of Michigan, who works with a guy named Richard Wrangham from Harvard. Some of you may have heard of that university. And they have some video of chimpanzees doing this, and what they discovered is that this is the prelude to fighting. When chimpanzees fight, they start by doing this. There's a very clear kind of behavioral pattern. Okay? And what happens is these chimpanzees are out, they're sniffing, they're quiet, they're silent. It looks like they call it a patrol because it looks like they're checking their territory, the edge of their territory, to see what else is out there. And when they're doing this, if that group of male chimpanzees finds another group of male chimpanzees, I know this is going to be a big surprise since we're talking about chimpanzee violence. You're never going to guess what happens when groups of males come into contact. They fight, right? Okay. Actually, what happens is if the group of male chimpanzees finds another group of male chimpanzees, they start shouting at each other. This is one of the ways that chimpanzees and humans are really similar. Rather than fighting, most of the time just calling each other names. They're screaming back and forth, hey you, I don't like you very much. You're not from around here. You're not my friend. That's the kind of things we all shout before we get in fights, right? Okay. Well, so the way chimpanzees do this is really distinct. They do something called a pant hoot. This is a picture of a chimpanzee in a pant hoot. Vast majority of cases, groups of male chimpanzees come into contact with each other, they go into a pant hoot. You heard me before, I was saying that when they're in the party, when they're with the females, they go, ooh, ah, 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 ah. When they start shouting at the other guys, it's a very different kind of call, right? And some of you guys have probably heard this on TV, that they start with a very rural, sort of it's a rumbling growl. It's a, oh, 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 oh. That's the pant part, right? Panting is what a dog does when it's hot. So a pant hoot starts with, oh, oh, and then it moves up, and they get and finally they start shouting. The part where you're not my friend, they say, arr, arr, arr. Right? So it's a, ooh, ooh, arr, arr. And you guys have heard this. I know you've heard this. It's on TV. It seems silly, but this is science. This is science. No. I had a professor in school who was really good at this. He could do all of the different calls. And aside from being a good way to make sure people are awake, and everyone's awake now, the reason that I'm showing you this is because, again, it shows you a really different kind of behavior. When the chimpanzees are with chimpanzees that they're related to, they're the female chimpanzees, the male chimpanzees they're related to, the baby chimpanzees, they're whoo, whoo, ah, ah, ah. You don't see my teeth, right? When they're doing a pant hoot like this, ah, ah, they're showing off their teeth. And to a chimpanzee, I wish I had a chimpanzee skull to show you, they're not very big animals, but they've got teeth like knives, like daggers, right? And so what this is a very, very, very serious threat. This is the equivalent of, flashing your piece if you're carrying a gun or something, right? Showing off your knife. They're telling the other chimpanzees, not just you're not my friend, but if you come over here, I'm going to bite you in the head, and it's going to hurt a lot, and then you'll die. So, vast majority of cases, when this happens, one group of chimpanzees leaves. The group that's smaller doesn't want to fight, they turn around and they go away. Occasionally, they will engage with each other, use these teeth, engage in really, really nasty, bloody fights. I have some video of this. I used to show it in this lecture, and frankly, it's too graphic. I decided not to. About 1 in every 3 male chimpanzees will end his life in this kind of violence. Right? That's worse odds than any city in America. I most recently lived in the city of Detroit, which has the highest crime rate in America. You have about a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by gunfire. You have a 1 in 3 chance, if you're a male chimpanzee, of dying in violence. So they are incredibly violent animals. Rip each other apart with these nasty teeth. So here is the violent scenario. Right? This is the data that we have to work with. So what can this, as the sum of our data about chimpanzee violence, what can this tell us about how humans fight wars, and whether or not humans fight wars for the same reasons as chimpanzees? To get at that, we have to look at the patterns, right, for chimpanzee patrols. And a lot of the answers to the question, sometimes if we had more time I would have started this lecture not with just what is war, but why do humans fight wars? And the answers to that usually are things like they fight over religion, they fight over resources like oil and water, they fight over access to females, reproduction, they fight over ideas. So looking at chimpanzees, this group, Matani and Wrangham, that studies chimp patrols, has looked over and over to try to figure out what it is that makes chimpanzees do this. Right? Again, as a scientist, as a social scientist, if that's your question, what you're going to be looking for now is correlations. If chimpanzees fight because they want resources, right, how would you put together a hypothesis? You would say that you expect a higher frequency of this kind of violent behavior when one group of chimpanzees doesn't have enough to eat, or when another group of chimpanzees has a lot more. Right? If they're fighting over sex, access to excuse me, I'm going to fall off, over females for reproduction, your hypothesis would be they're going to fight more often when one group of chimpanzees doesn't have enough adult females to make babies with. If you're going to say that they fight over religion, you're going to have to figure out how to understand chimpanzee religion, right? So we'll leave that one off. But the point is that trying to look at these hypotheses, tested, they all come up negative. Right? There's no correlation to food stress. There's no correlation to sex. There's no correlation to anything else we can find in terms of chimpanzees fighting. What this means is no one can tell you why chimpanzees do this. I'm not being mean. No one knows why chimpanzees do this. This is the frustrating part of being a scientist. This really interesting question, and I can't answer it for you. Of course, if you can answer it, you can make a good career in primatology, right? So what we know about chimpanzees is that there's no good reason that they fight. The only thing we know is that when they do fight, it's always when the groups are different sized. A bigger group of males will attack a smaller group of males. A smaller group of males will never attack a bigger group of males. A group of males will almost never attack a group of males that's the same size. But a big group of males will attack a small group of males. Okay, so, yeah, not so satisfying, not so exciting, doesn't tell us a lot, but Wrangham and Mittani, especially Richard Wrangham, we do know that occasionally this has the effect of expanding territory, and that can bring in females, but this is relatively uncommon. Just skip that one. Wrangham and Mittani have taken this together to try to understand why chimpanzees fight, and Wrangham in particular is interested in understanding why humans fight. And all they've been able to come up with is something called the imbalance of power model for chimpanzee violence. Now, what this says, and this is, I think actually this is a fairly hard one to get your head around because you're used to models that tell you, I'm used to models that tell me why people do things, why animals do things. And this one tells us there's no reason that we know of that chimpanzees fight, but we do know that they do so when the numbers are small. We know that given two groups of male chimpanzees, one bigger than the other, one will probably attack and kill the other. Okay, so this is a book called Demonic Males. Richard Wrangham, this guy from Harvard, wrote. I think we have it in the library. I have a copy. If you really want to read it, I can loan it to you. He takes this and he makes a model for human aggression. Knowing what we know now, knowing that chimpanzees fight when there are bigger groups, and it doesn't seem to be correlated to things like resources or religion, how would you guys translate that? If you had to take just this data and say, now we understand what this means for humans, what would you say? What does this mean for humans? Any thoughts? Go ahead.
Maybe it is in the nature of humans
Okay.
to be violent, since it is the leftover from primates from which humans are made.
Perfect. So that's exactly the place to start. It's fundamentally human nature to be violent, and there doesn't have to be a reason, right? I don't like this model for reasons that are scientific. I also don't like this model because I fundamentally believe people are good. But this is what this model tells us, is that fundamentally humans, and especially human males, are violent. Now, let's think about this just in terms of, let's say, travel planning. If you are a human male, and there are a few in this room, although not as many as human females, if you're a human male, and this is how you understand the world, what does this tell you about how you live your life? Let me pose it a little more directly. What does it mean that I am from the state of Kansas? It looks a lot like Kazakhstan, but it's 12 time zones away, and I now live in Kazakhstan. What should this mean for my life? Yeah, danger, right? The second I stepped off the plane in Astana back in 2011, a group of Kazakh men should have approached me and ripped me into pieces and spread well, I won't get into what they do after they've killed another man. It's pretty unpleasant. And let's just say it didn't happen, right? Instead, Kazakhstan has been very welcoming to me, including the men of the country, right? So, what this tells us about humans, if we change this imbalance of power model to humans, and this is what we do as anthropologists, if we're going to use primate data, if we're going to claim that chimpanzees tell us about being human, we have to take the models that we understand for chimpanzees, and the imbalance model works well for chimpanzees. I have no problem with that. But we have to be able to apply it into human behavior. What it would tell us is that humans will fight only, for one thing, when there's a low cost to the aggressor. Right? You get that? So, what I said before, a big group of chimpanzees will fight a small group of chimpanzees. A small group of chimpanzees will not attack a big group of chimpanzees. That means that in human terms, humans should only attack each other when they know they can win. Is that how life works? Lots and lots of evidence of that around us. What do they call it now? Asymmetric warfare? Also known as terrorism. You get a small group of people, in some cases even suicide bombing, guaranteed to lose the battle, but thinking they might win the war. Right? That alone makes this model wrong. We can look at many cases in history that are also dramatic. Actually, we can look at the Pamphilov division, right? Small group of Kazakh men who took out the German army. Very exciting stuff. Shouldn't have happened. By numbers, it wouldn't have happened. Also tells us that humans will only fight when they have overwhelming numbers. Again, not at all true. Wars constantly happening between well-matched armies. Tells us that the victims, people like me, I'm a potential victim in Kazakhstan because I'm not from around here. I should only travel in large groups. I should never go into Ostana alone. I love going and traveling in Ostana alone, traveling with my wife, whatever. This is not a problem. And that basically that human violence is only opportunistic, that it doesn't have good motivations. Again, we spent a whole semester on that. Okay, so the short end of this is that while the imbalance of power model is actually very popular, there are a lot of anthropologists who buy into it, and there's some good evidence to suggest that there's certain things about it that are good. My takeaway from it is that human war is way different, right? None of this applies to humans. Lots of good reasons we could go into. You might think about weapons, right? Projectiles make all the difference in the world. If you can fire a bow, or even throw a rock, certainly if you can shoot a gun or fire a missile, then the numbers mean nothing, because you can hide. You can take out more people than one at a time. Humans use stealth. So in my mind, the most interesting thing here is that humans have peace. Right? We have the ability to create peaceful relationships between communities who are not related. Kazakhstan and the United States. Me, personally, and lots of Kazakh men, is a good example of something that chimpanzees simply don't do. There's no case has ever been documented. Doesn't mean they won't be, but so far we have no evidence of male chimpanzee groups that are not related having a peaceful alliance with one another. So, to my mind, we can't use chimpanzees to understand how humans fight, or why humans fight wars, or where they came from. Okay. Does everybody sort of get the imbalance of power model? The basics are humans share an ancestry with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are known to be violent. Chimpanzees do group violence in a particular way. A group of people believes that we can use our understanding of chimpanzee group violence to understand human violence. But what that understanding is that chimpanzees fight only when it's a low cost to them, only when numbers are different, motivations are not volatile. My takeaway is that's not accurate. If you believe that that's accurate, that's actually great. You would get along with a lot more anthropologists than I do. Okay, so now we have to move on then. If that doesn't work, how else can we explain why and how humans fight wars? Funny you should ask, because I have some slides talking about that subject. So the next really common answer to this question is to look at something that's called sociobiology. And sociobiology, in sort of the Russian-speaking world, is actually a little bit different than it is in the English-speaking world. In the English-speaking world, sociobiology, also sometimes known as evolutionary psychology, which is an awkward word, sociobiology is the idea that human behaviors, all the stuff we do, the food we like, our choice in mates, what our favorite color is, whether you sleep late or get up early, all of that stuff is driven by your genetics. And since your genetics are impacted by human evolution on some level or another, all of the things that you do in your life, all the way down to whether you prefer the color yellow or the color green, has to do with human evolution. And so what sociobiology does is it tries to look back at evolutionary history and understand what environment could have made you make that choice. Right? This is where we get books like The Selfish Gene. Some of you have read Humans Are Selfish because it helps us gather more food and more mates and lets us win. Hogwash, but that's for another class. So, the sociobiologists approach the world often in terms of something called fraternal interest groups, FIGs, and a fraternal interest group is a very academic way of saying groups of related males. Families, right? One of the things we do well in anthropology is we make up words for things that are really obvious. A fraternal interest group is a group of men who are related to one another. Brothers, uncles, cousins, nephews, whatever. Do you guys know these guys? It's a fraternal interest group. This is the Blues Brothers. If you haven't seen the Blues Brothers, you have to see this movie. Classic example of a fraternal interest group. Two related men who are out helping to protect each other from the scary world around them. And basically the sociobiologists approach the question of violence by saying the world is organized by groups of fraternal interest groups. Everywhere around the world, states, tribes, religions, families are nothing but groups of related men and some women who hang out with them, and some kids that they make together, and they spend their lives trying to protect themselves. And that explains culture, religion, blah, 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 blah. Okay. You might already tell I'm not a big fan of this way of thinking about the world either, but it's a very common way of thinking about the world. So let's take a look at what it says. So the fraternal interest groups folks, and I'll move kind of quickly here, they answer the question about why do humans fight wars? Where does war come from? By simply saying, duh, it's obvious. Groups of males protect each other from other groups of males by killing other groups of males. And they do that so that they can live, so they can make more babies, so their genes go on, yada, yada, yada. It's a very compelling argument because it's very simple. Right? And it speaks, you know, if you've got a brother, I don't have a brother, I have some male cousins that I'm very close to, I have a father that I'm very close to. If you're a man with a male relative that you're close to, you might think, yeah, I would kill another man to keep him from killing my father. Does that mean that's where war comes from? Maybe not. Okay, so, again, we're doing science. Science! So, we have a model. Our big model that explains the world is groups of related men kill other groups of related men to protect groups that are related to them. So, what will that tell you if we want to test that? A hypothesis, a small question with a yes or no answer that will tell us if that's true. Come up with any? What kind of evidence might tell me that this is not true? What kind of evidence might tell me that groups of related men don't spend their lives protecting themselves from other groups of related men? Yeah?
Sometimes maybe there can be conflicts inside this fraternity intergroup.
Beautiful. Okay, so we all know that groups of men who are related to each other sometimes have conflicts. I certainly never have conflicts with my male relatives. We all have conflicts sometimes. And so the way that we would test this model is that we would say, we would want to look at the data. Right? We want to gather data about male aggression, about violence between men, and find out, is it true that men are more likely to kill men they're not related to than men they are related to? See how that works? If we go out and find data that shows us that men are more likely to kill other men that are closely related to them, and that tells us that maybe, just maybe, this isn't the whole story. And in fact, I won't go through the whole thing like I did with chimpanzees, but what I'll show you, if you take my warfare class, we'll read this stuff. A group of studies in the 1990s spent a lot of time looking at groups of related males in urban modern contexts, places like Detroit, where I'm from recently, where there's a lot of male-on-male violence. Also in tribal societies in places like Africa, also in developing nations. And what they found over and over and over again, by finding cases of male-on-male homicide, and then checking to see how closely related the males were, is that you are much more likely, if you're a man, to be killed by a man that you're related to than a man that you're not related to. You are, and if you think about this, right, we have this answer already, this is somewhat intuitive. You're going to spend more time with people you're related to. You have more anger with people you're related to. You have more opportunity to kill people you're related to. The case of warfare, where men do go out and kill people that they're probably not related to, although in the case of civil war, certainly that can happen. But in the case of warfare, this is a very relatively uncommon kind of violence. More men die in male-on-male homicide than anything else. So what this tells us is that something called social distance, social proximity, that is how closely related you are to somebody in social terms, or you remember the same kin group, the same clan, the same religion, the same ethnic group, the same country, the same nation. That's a fairly good predictor of violence. Right? The closer you are to somebody socially, the more likely you are to kill them. But that actually, that's a better predictor of violence than genetic kinship. You're more likely to protect somebody. It's a worse predictor of violence than genetic kinship. You're more likely to kill somebody that you're related to than you are to kill somebody that... Well, okay. So it's getting fuzzy here. One is a genetic relationship is not a good predictor of violence. Let me save you the details of those relationships because it gets very complicated very quickly. You're not likely to protect somebody you're related to. This model doesn't seem to work for us very well either. Okay. You guys know these guys? Step brothers. I like this one because this is a good example of social distance, right? These guys are not genetically related, but they think of themselves as a family because they're stepbrothers, and they would protect themselves just as much as humans who are genetically related. This, by the way, if you take my class, this is what we'll get into much more deeply. The ways that humans construct the idea of family, the way we understand who we're close to, who's worth protecting, are much more complex and important than biology. You're more likely again to protect somebody you think you're related to. Okay, so far we've got two models of warfare out there. We've got a model of warfare that tells us that humans kill each other, fight wars, because we're related to chimpanzees. The model for that doesn't work so well. Second model, fraternal interest groups, tells us that humans kill each other to protect other humans that they're related to. The evidence seems to suggest otherwise. The evidence seems to suggest we kill each other because of emotional things and all kinds of other stuff. Warfare is a relatively uncommon kind of violence. So, we come back to this question of where war comes from. And again, I'm not going to give you a final answer to this, but I do want to walk you through what I think is the elephant in the room, right? What I think is being overlooked in the conversation. I've been saying it, so I'm the one who's overlooking it. There's a really important part of warfare that we've been ignoring. And that, again, is what is war? Think about the fraternal interest groups example. What I just showed you is that men are more likely to kill other men in acts of homicide that they're related to. And I said, war is relatively uncommon. So war is distinct from homicide, right? And in war, men are killing men that they're not related to. So the only point there is that the genetics don't predict war. That's not the explanation for why humans fight wars. And again, without making you go through it, I think it's important to understand war as having a set of 7, but a set in general of attributes that make it different from other kinds of violence. Other kinds of violence, like homicide. It's different than homicide because it's collective. Right? Lots of men killing, lots of people, not just men in war. Sorry, we've been doing these biology things which tend to focus on men, which is one of the reasons I don't like them. Did you know? Woman-on-woman violence is much more deadly than male-on-male violence. This is very interesting also. This is an aside. But in cross-cultural studies, what we've found is that when men fight, they seldom kill each other. When women fight, they're much more likely to kill each other. Think about that. Yeah, chew on that until you take the class. But so it's different than murder because it's collective, right? It's different than, let's say, a bar fight. If you're in a bar with a group of your friends, or maybe you're in a football game and something happens and 2 groups of men fight each other, is that a war? I would say no, right? Because it's not organized and planned. Right? This planning and premeditation, you guys already mentioned, is very important for war. There's a sense of moral justification in war, right? Which is interesting. This clearly gets us out of the realm of animals, that typically when people fight wars, they at least claim that there's a moral justification. Morality is a whole other conversation. That groups are sanctioning war, let's skip that. That's a sort of complicated one that you can take prestige and honor. What's important for me when we look at war, and how war is different than any other kind of violence, is these 2 at the bottom. War is what we call instrumental, meaning that war has a purpose. Humans fight wars not just because they're angry, not just because they want to kill, not just because there are more of us than there are of them. Humans fight wars to do things. To claim territory, to claim people, to spread ideas. They fight wars in some cases simply to kill a group of people. Right? Genocide. Genocide is very uncommon as well. That's actually why this is so important. If it wasn't for the instrumentality of warfare, genocide would be very common. But in practice, almost every war in history has stopped at some point when somebody has thought they've achieved their objective or when they've been defeated. Interesting, right? And finally, there's this issue of social substitution. This is way complicated, but I do want to introduce you to it today. The idea of social substitution is that when we fight wars against each other, there's something really complex psychological happening. Right? Something we didn't talk about in fraternal interest groups. Men fight men because they're men, because of who they are. In chimpanzees, there's no sense of identity. So the chimpanzees are just killing other chimpanzees just because they're in a different group. But in human war, fascinating thing about human war, if you are unfortunate enough to become a person who's at war, you will be, someday in your life, trying to kill another person you've never met. How perverse is that? Right? How messed up is it that you can make yourself angry enough to try to take another person's life who you've never met, who you don't know anything about? Weird, right? The reason for that? Because they represent something. We talk about the Great Patriotic War, right? We have the Soviet army, the Nazi army, we have the American army fighting. And the men who are killing each other, and in some cases women, they've never met. They've been told by their country that they have to go and fight for an idea. So they're standing there in the trenches. It's a moving thing when you think about what they're doing. And they believe so strongly in an idea that they put that idea inside of someone else. And they're willing to take that other person's life on behalf of that idea. In some cases, they believe in a person. Right? That other soldier represents Adolf Hitler. That other soldier represents Stalin, or Pol Pot, or whoever it is. And so we're able to substitute a human being A living, breathing human who in another context we might sit down and have a shashlik with, right? But here, we're able to imagine them as this abstract thing and therefore take their life. As far as we know, there's no other animal on the planet that does that. Our ability to do that, you know, from an anthropological perspective, is fascinating. In this context, it's really ugly. Right? In this context, it results in the loss of life. But what's fascinating as an anthropologist is where else do we do that? You guys have any thoughts about where else in your social life you replace a person with an idea or with another person? How about marriage? This is a really interesting one. When you get married, you're bringing families together. Right? We have these whole big elaborate ceremonies where two people join together and their families are joined together. That's beautiful. Right? How about things like making peace treaties? When the president of China was here over the summer, he was representing the nation of China. And when he interacted with Nursultan Nazarbayev and later with Shigeo Katsu, he was doing so on behalf of the people of China. That's beautiful. Right? So there's this really cool thing about being human, that we're able to substitute other people for big ideas, for social groups, for individuals, in ways that's absolutely not seen anywhere else. And this, ultimately, to my mind, is what separates war from any other kind of violence. Right? Any other kind of violence that we can see, you've got individuals representing individuals. The closest we can get to this is capital punishment, where you have a state taking some individual's life on behalf of a state. Right? A criminal has offended the state, so we have to kill them. But in that case, we still kill the individual. We don't kill the individual's brother. We kill that individual. Right? There's obviously some fuzzy edges around that we can explore elsewhere. Okay, so that's what I'm going to leave you. My answer for why humans fight wars is a very fuzzy one. It's to make you think war is something different than other kinds of violence. It's this very complex social process. And to understand why humans fight wars, we have to understand it as basically a symbolic process. We're violent in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of parts of our lives. Whatever. So is every other animal on the planet. But when we start substituting people and ideas, and using that in a violent context, we've done something very special. Okay, so we've got these different ideas, right? It's this very complex thing. There's this imbalance of power, right? It doesn't fit. Internal interest groups doesn't fit. And I'll let you think about it until you find yourself in my class. So, any questions or thoughts about this? No? I wish I have a really cool picture. I forgot to put in the slides today. You guys know Banksy, the graffiti artist? Yeah. He's got this really cool mural he did in London once, where it's a hippie protester who's got a peace sign, and he's stabbing somebody to death with it. And I feel like in some ways that's the answer to why humans fight wars. We have arguably evolved this ability to create these symbolic links because it allows us to do these beautiful things like creating peace treaties and having marriages, things that no other animal does. This allows us to be friends with each other. This allowed me to move to Kazakhstan and not be ripped apart by Kazakh men when I got off the airplane. Chimpanzees don't do that because they don't have the symbolic ability. And a byproduct, I think, is this ability to fight war. Okay. But that's sort of metaphysical. So, okay, well, thank you all. It's been a lot of fun. And I'll be happy to be in touch with you by email or anything.